Good afternoon, branch campuses from around the state. My name is Phil Mixter, coming to you from the Pullman campus, and I'm simply introducing the afternoon session for about the next hour. We're going to focus on technology that engages students in a couple of different contexts. Just really briefly, our first presentation is about GoPro video in the surgical lab session, or setting rather, and we have Dr. Rob Keegan and Dr. Julie Noyes from the clinical training program associated with veterinary clinical sciences at Washington State University. Our second presenter is Brian Collins, an assistant professor in physics and material sciences, and he's going to talk about using Perusal, which is a software program that allows discussion of PDF content asynchronously by your students. You can use that with textbooks that are available online, and Brian will talk more about that. Our last presentation is Dr. Tom Salsbury, who's an associate professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning. He teaches in the elementary and secondary education programs, and he will use AMS in a number of ways in the Masters in Teaching program. And his students are divided between Pullman and Spokane, so he'll solve the distance challenge in a number of creative ways for future K through 12 teachers. So with that, I'll encourage you to settle in, and I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Keegan to talk about GoPro videos in surgical training.
Okay, great. Thanks, Phil. As Phil mentioned, my name is Rob Keegan. I am an anesthesiologist at the vet school here at WSU. And then you're going to be hearing from Dr. Julie Noyes, who is working with me on this project to assess our students using GoPro videos during their anesthesia and surgery labs. I just kind of wanted to set the stage and talk a little bit about how we got where we are. This is a timeline from the time I've been here. I realized I've been here a really long time now, coming here in 1988. And it's just a timeline of how we have taught our anesthesia course and how we've incorporated clinical skills into anesthesia. And so the timeline is listed there, and then there is a little arrow that shows the amount of clinical experience, relative clinical experience that our students have gotten, the different methods that we've used to teach. So when I first came, the anesthesia course was simply a lecture-only course. We did participate in a live animal laboratory, but it was not part of the course per se. Later on, that was not the best way we thought to teach anesthesia, and we felt that it had to have some type of a clinical laboratory component. So we added a laboratory component to that, and I do believe the clinical experience went up. That's my personal opinion, and also from student evaluations and evaluations from surgeons in later labs. For a variety of reasons, all of them good, we have sort of phased out our live animal teaching laboratories. For purely laboratory, we introduced a variety of computer simulations and models, several of them that we developed here at the college. And then eventually in 2010, we eliminated most of our live animal laboratories, again, for some very good reasons. But that kind of left our students with a decline in their clinical experience. And so in an effort to increase their clinical experience without using live animals, we thought about employing some high-fidelity simulation into their training together with our lecture. And so that's where the arrow points upward and points to a question mark. It's an interesting question to us to evaluate this and to find out if it's working, how well it's working, and how we might adjust it to kind of help our students in the future. So the simulation that we have developed in our clinical simulation laboratory is a hybrid simulation that's a computer simulation of anesthetic machine and monitor, and that can be seen in the upper right slide in the big computer screen there. That is controlled usually by me in the back room, and I will manipulate varying monitor settings, control patient's blood pressure and EKG and heart rate and all that stuff. The students are on the other side of the room, and they're in a mocked up surgery room with an anesthesia machine and like I said, a task trainer for a patient. And so they will respond to the simulation, they will adjust controls and settings on the anesthesia machine and respond to various events that they would see in an actual live patient. And we do this without any live patients, just with the computers and with the mannequins. So we developed several scenarios that the students would see in typical conductive anesthesia on a live animal. And we came up with several learner takeaways for each of these scenarios, what we wanted the students to take away or get out of this session, and then ways of performance measures, how we would measure if the students got the takeaways appropriately, if they performed adequately. And so those are kind of listed up there. These are very time consuming to create. They take probably 4 to 8 hours to create each one, but the good part is once you've created one, you can reuse it and reuse it for many, many times. The right part of the slide just shows a progression of events in the simulation, a series of states that the simulation goes through and what the students experience through that. And of course, we adjust the simulation on the fly based on the students' responses. So this is a recorded session that is in our simulation lab, and I'm just going to play a short clip of this. And you may or may not be able to hear the student banter that's going back and forth. But there is the monitor, the simulation, computer simulation we developed. It's got parts of an EKG, parts of an anesthetic machine, and various monitors that display heart rate, temperature, and all various things that you would see when providing anesthesia to a patient. So this goes on. The students will see potentially adverse effects occurring, and then they will go ahead and they will respond to those adverse effects, and then their response is evaluated in the simulation, and conditions change, and they can see what the results of their actions are. So part of what we're interested in doing is not only replacing the live animal laboratories with non-live animal equivalents or potentially things that are better, but we're interested in how well we were doing, so some way of assessing the students. So there's two parts of that. I'm going to talk about the first part, and then Julie is going to go talk about the clinical assessment that occurs in their subsequent junior surgery live animal lab that they do the following semester. But for in terms of assessment for just the simulation course itself, we did a self-efficacy study before and after the course, and we asked them a variety of questions about, can I do this skill or can I not do this skill at this time? And we also gave them a written quiz. So prior to taking the course, prior to having the simulation instituted, the scale ran from 0 to 10. 0, I can't do it at this time, to 10, I can. Before, they scored an average of a 3 on there, and then after they took the course, again taking the same self-efficacy study, they scored an 8.6. And similar results were obtained with the written quiz. It was a written quiz of performing anesthesia in a patient, and the pre-scores were just over 15, and the post-scores were essentially double at over 30. So just based upon the student's own self-assessment, which admittedly is not a tremendously valid way of assessing their efficacy, we show some improvement in that. So the next part of this, Julie will talk about what we've done to actually assess using GoPro cameras to assess their anesthetic clinical skills in subsequent live animal laboratories. So Julie.
Thank you, Dr. Keegan. So as Dr. Keegan mentioned, we wanted to make sure that the clinical skills they were developing in the simulation lab were also transferring to when they saw live patients. So we decided to use GoPro cameras to assess their clinical skills, and the way that we did this was we had them wear them in junior surgery, which is essentially their first live animal lab after they would have done the simulation lab. And really, there are many more benefits to the GoPros in the classroom than just assessing the students for our study. We can actually see everything from the student's perspective, so we know that we're all on the same page. We also allow them to look at their videos so they can self-assess using the same rubric that we use to assess them as well and provide feedback. And one additional benefit that is really great is that we can evaluate our program, so we can determine, do we actually have the right resources, do we have enough staff, and should we make any changes to this lab? And this is just an image from a student's perspective of putting in an IV catheter in a dog. So to assess the students, we had the data collection method, which was the GoPros, but now we needed the instrument to be able to assess their performance. And we created a rubric with the help of many people, so it was a team effort. We had Dr. Olusola Adesope from the College of Education, who's an expert in multimedia and education. We had Dr. Bonnie Campbell, who is a clinical surgeon who's been involved in junior surgery for many years and also developed a rubric for the surgical side. And then Dr. Susan Matthew also helped us. She has a PhD in veterinary medical education. So what we ended up with is this sort of performance criteria, and this applies to really 5 areas, such as putting in an IV catheter, intubating, monitoring, moving the patient, and also there's an area for professionalism, because as you saw with that video, we also are able to hear what the students are saying, so we can assess whether their communication skills are good or not. So this is a quick video that demonstrates a student with a GoPro camera on, and she's going to be putting in an IV catheter. And you can see from her perspective, she can get distracted, things are going on around her. And then when we want to assess, we can zoom in and really look at the situation. Is her thumb actually in the right position next to the vein? Is she holding the catheter correctly? When she gets a flash, does she advance appropriately? So currently we are in data collection. Literally there are 9 students at this moment in the surgical lab with GoPros on their heads. And we have done about 100 students, so we have 100 videos that we've been going through. And eventually when we get all of these compiled, we'll have external reviewers using the rubric to assess the students. And that's where we are right now. And we want to thank, of course, our technicians, our students, and also the Teaching Academy who provided us funding to be able to do this project. Thank you.
Any questions? I might have one of this. Could you use the microphone, Brian?
Very nice presentation. I guess I'm just curious, with the GoPro type of assessment, would this at all be useful in the application in the new medical school that is being set up, say in monitoring interviews or clinical interviews with patients?
Yeah, actually on the human side, in the human medical field, they've been using GoPros and wearable recording devices for a while. And they use them mostly for instruction so that professors can be doing surgery deep in a body cavity, somewhere that the students wouldn't necessarily be able to see, and then using the GoPro, the students can watch that afterwards. Less often they've been using the GoPros for assessment, so that's a little bit of a new field for us and also for them.
I wonder about the hybrid simulation. Do students find that it's a pretty authentic way to start their training process? There's no sort of remorse that there isn't a live animal involved, or a sense that this doesn't really count? They buy into the simulation pretty well?
You know, we were and still are concerned about that, and we have 3 rules. 2 main rules when they come into the sim room, and one rule is that the sim room is just like Las Vegas, we'll tell them. And what we mean by that, I mean there's no slot machines or anything, but what we mean by that is whatever happens in this room stays in this room. So we keep everything to, you know, ourselves, and we don't talk about it afterwards, and that's kind of a safety thing to give them an opportunity to explore different things. But the other part is that the students, when they come into the room, we expect them to suspend their disbelief about that this is all fake and it doesn't matter, and that's key to doing simulation. So it's funny to watch them go through sequential simulations. The first time there's much giggling and silliness, and they're kind of getting used to it. And after the second and third time, they're really into it, and they're concerned for the patient, and they're worried about choices that they've made because they can see the results immediately thereafter. So I think we've been pleasantly surprised that most of the students are able to get beyond that. And many of the students in their comments after going through a simulation, they'll say, I can't imagine having to do a live animal laboratory without having this experience first. So,
right. You want to make those errors in simulation
absolutely
before a client animal's life is on the line, or a patient in human medicines.
Yes, absolutely.
I was also interested a little bit about your survey. Did you do any surveys before you switched? That self-efficacy data is interesting, but I wonder if it's different with the simulation lab over a live animal.
No, we did not do a survey of just live animal students, so yeah, that would be interesting to know.
I don't know what the control would be there. I guess that's what I was sort of getting at.
Yeah.
All right. Any questions from across the state? All right. Hearing none, seeing none, we'll move on to our next presenter, Brian Collins. We're a little ahead of schedule, so doing just great.
You are? Oh, I don't see it.
That should be open.
Yeah. Just let me. It changed its.
No, I'm sorry, Brian. So you'd have to go to that folder.
Which one?
Collins. I don't see that one. Is that something you emailed to Brian?
Yes. A couple days ago.
You have it on a thumb drive there in your pocket?
Well, I actually no, I have it on my computer.
I do. Okay. Look at that. The joy of technology is redundancy.
That's right. All right, thank you very much. All right, yeah, so I'm Brian Collins. I'm an assistant professor, been here for 2 years at WSU in the Department of Physics and Astronomy, and also, as you mentioned, in the Materials Science and Engineering program. So I'm going to talk about this online text discussion platform known as Perusall, and how we've been using it in the class that I have been developing for this semester. In fact, we're using it right now. So just a quick background of the course that I teach, or I am teaching literally for the first time this semester, is Physics 101. It's an algebra-based physics course. 4 credits, 3 lectures a week, 2-hour lab. About 300 students in 2 sections. There's 2 of us teaching it. Fred Giddis is the other faculty in the department teaching it. We basically have one full TA, equivalent of one full TA per section. So we don't have enough of manpower really to aid in kind of in-class interaction on a regular basis. These TAs are really just for grading exams. It's seen as a very difficult course for the students. A lot of pre-meds, pre-vets. Often this course is required for their major, and so requiring a lot of analytical, quantitative information and logical deduction. So it's something that a lot of these students haven't seen before. Some of the things that we wanted to do, though, is to have the students get a little bit better prep for class. basically allowing us to spend more time in class, in the lecture, doing a little bit more active learning. So there are a number of active learning methods known as, for example, think, pair, share, where they actually interact with each other to help teach aspects that they're having difficulty understanding. That takes a lot of extra time in class, and so reduces the amount of time that we have to really just lecture to them. And so what we want to be able to do is focus more on the aspects that the students are having difficulty with, and for that we need more feedback in terms of what the students are understanding as they are going through the material, and what they're not understanding, and what we might need to emphasize in the lecture. So those two needs we feel are met with this text discussion platform known as Perusall. It is, I guess there's this too. It's based on a social media platform to hold discussions over a text. Essentially, the students can log in with Facebook, Twitter, or just make a personal account on that site. It is actually started at Harvard University, professor known as called Eric Mazur, and essentially what they do is they have threads where they highlight the text, they pose a question or a comment, people can reply to that or answer the question. There's like buttons and so forth to indicate that I had this question also, or hey, you answered my question. Basically, it's very similar to like a Facebook discussion. You actually see, if they've logged in with Twitter or Facebook, you see their icon that you would see in Facebook. The login also allows the algorithm, since there are hundreds of students, they can't all discuss at once, so it allows them to cluster the students with friends or people that they're connected with, so that they can discuss with people they know. It also importantly includes an automatic assessment and grading of the comments. So this is, I believe, really important for a high participation rate. The students essentially need to comment throughout the text and show that they are thinking about the text and trying to understand it, trying to assess and what they're reading. And so, for example, in my case, these assignments are every day before every class, and they represent 10% of the final grade. The nice thing about this is it's free, and in fact, we are using an open source textbook, College Physics from OpenStax. And so the entire process is carried out on servers essentially on Harvard's campus, but it is a separate company at this point, not for profit. And because we're using this open source textbook, it's completely free to us and to the students. You can use proprietary textbooks. It depends on the publisher in terms of what those fees are. Typically, they're lighter than the typical textbook because they have access only through this web app. You cannot actually, you actually have the choice to allow them to download the PDF or not onto their own personal computers. And we actually have a pretty high participation rate. The big question we had when this was kind of demonstrated to us at Harvard was, well, these are Harvard students. They're highly motivated. You know, what if you have a student population that's not quite as motivated? This is just a quick, this data is from one of the chapter readings that we had. Essentially, 1 through 4 Perusall score that the computer automatically scores for each individual. We have a more than 80% participation rate. And those basically from the higher scores, 2 to 4, you know, about 2/3 are doing a very good job in really posting comments and discussing vigorously with each other these aspects that they're trying to understand. And essentially we scored basically out of 3 points, so then we can actually, you know, it's really just a kind of a participation. And we can also assess, in fact, I'm not showing this, but they have a this metadata in terms of, for example, when they are posting these comments. And you can see essentially it's the night before. They are sitting down and doing the reading, discussing with each other, but it also happens after that period and can be asynchronous, as was mentioned earlier. So this is an example. It's very easy to create assignments. You simply upload a PDF, any PDF that you have access to. In my case, it automatically read the table of contents, and I can just highlight certain sections and click on the date that I want to do, the time I want it to be due, and that's it. It's created. This is what the students see. So this is an example of a page. It's just in a browser that you read, and most of the text here is highlighted at this point because this is kind of an all students view, so you're literally 300 students. At some point, somebody's going to highlight every single thing, but I can click on a specific thread, and it'll highlight where they were highlighting, and the discussion you can see on the right side there. Somebody posing a question, you can click on the question mark saying, I had that question too, or somebody answering the question, people can click on the check mark saying, hey, that made sense to me, that helped me out. Again, these are everybody's comments. What the students see, though, are they're clustered in certain groups, and you can set that as an instructor, how large of a group that you want. I think at this point it's like 20 students see each other's comments at a time. It's also great for just-in-time teaching. This is a method that is used for extra feedback loop to maximize the quality of class time. It's been used for, I guess, a few decades now. It usually involves web-based quizzes, which are due just before class. You ask them a question, the A, B, C, D, they answer, and you see how many got it right or wrong, and that tells you how to assess how well they understand that particular thing. We do this in this method where we have it due 1 hour before class, this discussion basically. And the computer automatically compiles what they call a confusion report that uses kind of clustering algorithms to figure out where people are having the most misunderstandings or questions about certain topics within the reading, highlights them in a report for you. So the hour before class, I look at this confusion report, and it shows me all the comments that are represented in that cluster, and I can adjust, therefore, my lecture material that I'm about to talk about to target specifically those aspects that people are having the most confusion. I can actually read a question. Oftentimes people try to answer it, and they maybe even answer it incorrectly because of a misconception, and so I can actually bring that up and target and try to help people get through some of those difficulties. It also helps to keep students invested in attending class because essentially during the class I usually mention a particular concept that I'm explaining and say a lot of people had a question about this on perusal, or in times I actually even display direct quotations from the students and say they have this question, and I just answer it right in front of them. So they actually get to see their own question posed on the board anonymously, but that way they feel invested in the system, and they come to class to try to have some of these questions answered. Typically the way I do it is I do not interact with them on perusal at all. I do not answer anybody's questions. I let them answer their own questions or discuss it amongst themselves. Oh, this is an example of the confusion report. There are certain topics, and you can see certain quotes from the students on the side and which page it was from, and then I can just highlight those, copy and paste them into my slides or whatever. And so the question becomes, so essentially we feel like we have these students reading the night before they come to class. In previous semesters, it has been clear that some students don't even bother to buy the text. The textbooks in these classes are typically anywhere from $180 to $250, so it's very expensive, and if students can get away with not reading the text, then they might not even buy it, and therefore not even read it. So we feel like at least they are reading through it in a separate situation. They're assessing the material just before class. They're seeing it once and then seeing it again in lecture. We are developing several assessment metrics right now. This, again, is the first semester we're doing this. We do have standardized tests in physics called like for example, a force concept inventory that is a before and after test to calculate learning gains, and we are in the process of doing that. But a quick initial metric here is just a correlation of the perusal grades with the first exam score in the class earlier in the semester. We do seem to have somewhat of a correlation with the perusal score. So the people essentially reading, be really on top of things and reading before they come to class seem to be doing slightly better in the exams. And that's it. Yeah.
So I'm really interested in how you could use the confusion report to fold back into the editing of the textbook. Since this is an open textbook and editable by you, have you ever thought to use those confusion reports to refine the text, to improve it so that the confusion doesn't continue?
Sure. Actually, I have not thought of that. That's a really good point. One thing, though, that I find is that the places in the textbook that are not very good actually tend to be the best places where the discussion happens, where students really kind of get together and they start talking about this and trying to hash it out. And in some ways, that's actually better, where they're actually thinking about it amongst each other and figuring it out rather than just reading it and saying, oh, that makes sense, and moving on. But I agree, that is one way to do it, because these are open textbooks that are welcome comments and ways to improve it.
Okay. Also, I've heard that Perusal might have been sold by Eric Mazur. Yeah,
Well, it's a separate company now.
Okay.
I believe he is co-CEO or something like this. But yeah, it's its own company. I am in contact with the Brian Lukoff, who's the kind of the main CEO now of the company. In fact, because there are some issues that we've been working on trying to address plagiarism, and we have seen some of that this semester, and so adding in some of those automatic filters to look for some of that, for example.
But it's still free to use.
Yes,
Okay.
It's still free.
Great, thanks.
Other questions? I'll add that we're using Perusal in a different sort of way, but we do it for an asynchronous kind of journal club. So any PDF, you could start with a research paper, assign it to the class, or assign it to an interest group, and then it allows that discussion to occur on the PDF. You know, you highlight a text, and then you get that same interaction with peer-to-peer learning,
Yeah,
which I
absolutely.
talked a little bit about this morning, and I think that's really working in a lot of different contexts, not just a large class like yours with an open source textbook. So anytime you have a primary resource that can be converted to a PDF, you can use Perusal to create, sort of rally around it
discussions,
and get the social interaction.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I have created a separate journal club class, you might call it, for my research group. We haven't really gotten started with that, but I started uploading journal articles that I think are kind of important for the group to at least be aware of and maybe start discussing. So I agree, that's a big opportunity there as well. The question really is if this is going to stay free. Pearson or somebody might just decide we're going to buy this thing. So that's, I think, a big question here.
I was going to say, with journal clubs for faculty development, I never run the confusion report. That's just what I stay away from. So.
Yeah, I don't think you would need that.
Any other questions? All right, hearing none, we'll...
Oh, it looks like somebody was raising their hand over there.
Lauren in Spokane. How do you access Perusal? Like, how would we gain access to that? Because I can see that being used for a few things.
Sure. I mean, I think you just go to the website and you say you would like to sign up as an instructor.
So
Yeah.
Perusal.com?
Yep, Perusal.com.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
And the instructor side, the back side, has some things you might there's a learning curve with any software, but
Yes.
But I think it's pretty intuitive, and the students have really gravitated to it in my experience as well. So.
Yeah, and the grading aspect for the class is very simple. I mean, you just download the CVS file, and you can incorporate that in any way you like with your class grade. And in fact, you can adjust all of the assessments kind of to your liking. You know, how many annotations do you want them to be actually making for an assignment? What's the point spread of everything? Things like that.
Right, and I think Perusal uses that social algorithm to sift through significant comments and score them.
Yes.
And I think you mentioned that.
And by the way, that... Sorry. that can be connected to the Blackboard grading
Yes.
tool also.
Yes, they have that. I haven't been using that because the way I read it, it sounded like you couldn't have them log in with Facebook if they did that. They'd have to log in through Blackboard. And so I just wanted to try it with the ability. And most people are, you can see their little Facebook icons and things like that. So it seems like people are actually doing it that way. But that is another thing that you could do, is you could actually have it piped, all the grades piped directly to Blackboard without you doing anything.
All right, so we'll go ahead and move on, clicking right along to our last presenter, Tom Salsbury. So you can grab that mic from Brian.
Arrow button to move it forward. Great. All right. All righty. So thank you. Thanks for inviting me here today. I'm going to talk about a course that I teach in the Master's in Teaching program. This is in the College of Education. It's a course for elementary and secondary future teachers, so teachers in training. And it's a course that's specifically designed for teaching English language learners in content classrooms. The students are divided between Pullman and Spokane. And this is a course I teach once a year through AMS. Normally our courses are face-to-face, so I have that added challenge of working with future teachers and how do we teach kids face-to-face, but we're doing it through an AMS environment. So it can be quite challenging to get our students to connect with each other within the class. It can be a little bit challenging to help them see how to actually apply these methods when we're doing it through the AMS environment. And what happens is students, if we have a big group in Pullman and say a small group in Spokane, which is the way it is currently, our Pullman students, because they're such a big group, they have a tendency to overwhelm a small group in Spokane. So the students in Spokane might want to have a question, and they're kind of being overwhelmed by the Pullman students. A lot of times we're in the campfire setting with a kind of a center podium and students sitting around it, which is very intimate and really a great setup for our Pullman students. But for our Spokane students, sometimes they feel a little bit overwhelmed. So my challenge is to try and connect with the students. I want to pull the Spokane students into the class so they feel that they can really engage with the activities that we're doing. Because we're working through the AMS environment, everything has to be electronic. It wouldn't be like a face-to-face class where I can bring in my cart of materials. We need to improvise and still feel as though the students in the class, our teacher candidates, are getting a good experience. So I really basically allow them. I'm trying to model good pedagogy, and then I want my students to be able to practice and apply what they're learning. So they're going to have to use this technology as well. So in a nutshell, we pretty much pull out all the stops. We're going to use all of our technology that's available to us in order to model good pedagogy, reflect on that, and really connect with each other. So that's what I want to talk about first, is how do I create that classroom environment which any good teacher would want to create, where your students feel connected with each other, feel connected with themselves through these two campuses. So of course we use Blackboard Learn. I post all of our materials in the course beforehand. We use our announcements. Make sure that everyone knows what's going to happen, because I don't have that face-to-face environment with my students, to make sure everyone's on page. I communicate through email. We do use our cell phones, and in fact I encourage it because there's so many opportunities to communicate with each other. in class. So we have those ready to go. As I already mentioned, we have our campfire set up, which is, I just think it's super cool, over in Terrell 106. We sit around this space. We've got our 360-degree camera, and whoever's speaking, the camera shines on them, so we're able to really get a much more intimate kind of environment. But then at the same time, that technology can be a little bit overwhelming, as I already mentioned. And so I'm trying to learn how to use the sound better, to silence or mute when I need to, so that way groups can work on campus without feeling overwhelmed by the other campus because of the noise. So we use that a lot. And I've also take down the PowerPoint so that I don't feel so connected to that presentation, and I can rather engage with the students. Pull down the PowerPoint, we can actually see each other, which I think is really important for our students who are on the other campus. In the class itself, I work hard to model engaging activities, because these are, after all, future elementary, secondary teachers. And so I do a variety of different activities, and all of them using lots of technology. So of course, I'll bring in my video clips. They're either on DVD or online, so we can see some classroom models and then reflect on what we're seeing in our videos. I also, because this is a course that is specifically for teaching English language learners, it's important for students to understand what different levels of language proficiency or English language proficiency sound like. So I need to bring those samples in. We don't have access to the class, so we're actually listening to those samples, noticing various characteristics of that language, and then discussing that. We do what we call jigsaw readings. We'll have students working in their home groups, organizing readings, going off into what we call expert groups to read a particular reading, to really know it well, and then go back to their home group. So this is, again, a strategy that we use in our elementary, secondary classrooms. And so we're trying to model it here. For some of the more ambitious days, we might even try and communicate across campus. So we'll have groups working together, 2 students in Pullman and 1 student in Spokane, and they'll be working with their phones to and communicate with each other. We have a particular type of social skills development tool that we can use with our elementary, secondary kids that we try to model then in our classes with the candidates. And this is called a social skills teach chart. So normally in a classroom we would have poster paper with, say, respect. And so what does respect look like? What does respect sound like in a teach chart? And then the students can decide, well, this is what it looks like when we respect each other, and this is what it sounds like, this is what we say when we respect each other. Well, we can do this, although we're in 2 different campuses, I can do this in Word, and we can develop our own social skills teach chart. Another typical activity in a classroom, elementary, secondary classroom, would be a poster walk. So students build posters, and then they can move around and talk to each other about the different things that they developed for whatever type of content that we might be working on. But I can do this in BB Learn, and I can also use the document camera, so students can take pictures of what they've developed, send it to BB Learn, and boom, we can do a poster walk in that way as well. There's sorting and categorizing activities that we would do in a normal elementary, secondary classroom with, columns and cards, and we would sort of move these around. Well, I can do the same thing in PowerPoint. So, I experiment with that so that teachers know what they can do if, in a regular classroom, but we can model it through the technology. There's a type of activity called a fishbowl, which in the campfire setup works really well. Where basically you have a group who have a discussion, and then the rest of the class are listening into this discussion, and then giving their feedback in the end. And so in the campfire setup through AMS, that works out really nicely. We can model that through AMS. We did an exercise with demographics research, basically so that our teacher candidates will understand the school demographics of the, where they'll be doing their student teaching. So we can do that in groups, and we do a lot of online work, oftentimes across campus. And then, there's the times where we split off into our on-site groups. We can do work around consensus formation, what we call ear-to-ear reading, think, pair, share, which was mentioned earlier. So we can do all of these activities, even though we're on 2 different campuses. Then hopefully our teacher candidates are able to see modeled, and then they can use when they go and do their practicums, which all of them are doing at the time of this particular class. And about halfway through the course, we shift from sort of me doing most of the presenting and students kind of participating to the students actually taking charge of the practicing and the applying. So they'll then choose a strategy, use the technology, develop the class, and then take us through. So for example, in this semester alone, we had one group do a story reenactment. They used Word and BB-Learn and PowerPoint. They had students work in small groups. They read a story called The Story of Samara, and then they reenacted that story in the class, and then we got to see them do their story reenactment on both campuses. We can do another strategy called the interactive read aloud, which is similar in some ways to what you were just describing, where you're able to have a reading, a text, and then you have small groups who are discussing that text and asking questions. And this group did it in a jigsaw reading. They had expert groups and home groups. And then they developed a Kahoot to test comprehension. So they used all that technology in their class. We have another strategy for reading really hard texts. So, rather than watering down text, we say, well, what do we do when we're working with texts that are beyond a student's level of reading ability? So we have some strategies to help with that, and this one's called GIST. And then finally, we had groups who were exploring another strategy around graphic organizers. So they, we actually did it yesterday, talking about Title IX. So we did some readings on Title IX and then developed graphic organizers to help us process new language and new concepts. And all of these are strategies to help language learners. And so that is how we use technology in this class.
Questions?
So Tom, I realize you had a limited amount of time to talk about this, but is there a way that we could get access to these in more detail?
Oh, the different strategies?
Yeah, these different strategies. For example,
absolutely.
yeah, I'd like to learn more about each individual one in more detail.
Oh, absolutely.
Just for example, the jigsaw reading, what does that look like in Blackboard?
Sure. Well, so a jigsaw reading, the basic idea is to help expedite reading and also to go a little bit deeper. So that way you're not overwhelming your kids. So what we did in this particular case, because I'm working with adults, I did a lesson on language programs in the state of Washington. So we did it through a jigsaw reading, and students were given in groups. They first started out as, we call it a school group. So their task was to choose a language program for their particular school. So they sat down, they had 7 different programs to choose from. Everyone grabbed a program. That was their home group or their school group. And then they went off to their expert groups. And everybody in that expert group was reading the same, about the same program. So you'd have groups of 3. Mm-hmm. And 3 would read about one program, 3 would read about another program, and they would finish 10, 15 minutes later, and then they go back to their school group. And each had then a different program that they were going to share as if we were a school board and we had to decide on a school program. So I'm going to tell you about the bilingual program. I'm going to tell you about the sheltered English program. I'm going to tell you about the newcomer program, right? So they each shared their programs, and then as a school had to decide, based on the demographics that they knew from the previous project, what program they were going to select. So that's how the jigsaw worked, is basically everyone has a different piece of information to bring to the table. So it's not just everyone talking about what we already know, but we actually have a reason to communicate. And so that's helpful for reading, it's helpful for oral language skills, and social skills as well. So that would be an example of a jigsaw.
Okay, so each 3-person group would make posts in Blackboard as these communications?
Well, this was all oral, so
Oh,
it was synchronous, yeah. And so what we did then was we had our Pullman groups, then we had our Spokane groups, and then the Spokane was one school district, and then because it's a small group, Pullman was we had more students, so we had more schools. So it was actually synchronous, and we just did it right there in class.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure, thanks, Erin.
Thanks. Just in that example, I brought up a question. If I understand it right, you broke up from your schools and then you made expert groups to
Correct.
discuss an individual program.
Yeah, an individual language program.
Did that breakup pose issues for, say, the Spokane students in joining an expert group?
Great, yeah, it's a great question. So what we did is then the expert groups were communicating with Spokane. We were texting. Perusal would actually work very well in this case, because I could have actually posted that document, and they could have been highlighting some things and typing in their questions. So that would have been a nice addition. But yeah, so we would be talking on phones, right? They pull out their phones. They, 2 folks in Pullman, 1 person in Spokane, and then they would be answering each other's questions that they had about that reading, strengths, weaknesses of the program, things like that. Yeah, so that's how that worked. Yeah, thanks. Good question.
Tom, my question would be, in a situation where, say, a student in Pullman is having a conversation with a student in Spokane, my challenge is always that those interactions happen and they're gone, they're ethereal. And I wonder if is there any component that's more reflective, where you try and use an LMS like Blackboard to capture it?
Yeah.
So that it's more visible to the other groups, there's that added value that you can do meta work?
Yeah, great question. So one of our groups who did the interactive story retell, we decided, I work with the groups as they're preparing their class. We decided to do outcome statements in Blackboard in a discussion. So it created a forum. And the question was, would you be able to use this particular strategy in your content area? Because our students come from all different content areas. So this was a group of elementary teachers, who are also working with physics and math and, history and all of our different content areas. So it was a really nice way for students then to jump into Blackboard and say, oh yeah, I could use this for the lesson that I'm teaching on, American history, blah, blah, blah. And we had a record of all of those discussions, and that was really helpful, both for the students doing it and then for everyone to kind of see, how people were applying. Yeah, thanks. Good question.
Other questions from other campuses? All right. Somehow we managed to almost get back on time, so I'll hand the microphone to Rebecca.
Before we finish this session, can I show a website? Can I show content on the computer? We've talked about several different technology tools. Thank you very much, Tom.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And I learned about one recently called Pear Deck. Is anybody familiar with Pear Deck? So the demo here that they've got on their website is more. Can you go to Pear Deck? PearDeck.com. This seems to be geared more towards kids, and but I think could be used really well in a face-to-face classroom. So yeah, would you just play that demo? So I just thought I'd take a minute to share this. Yeah, I thought there was just a video. Yeah.
Pear Deck will change the way you present slide decks in a live classroom setting. When you hit Start Presenting in Pear Deck, you're creating a live session for participants to join on their own computer, tablet, or smartphone. As the instructor, you control the flow of the presentation from your computer or tablet. On their devices, participants can respond to your pre-planned or impromptu questions throughout the presentation with a number of unique interaction types. Those responses can then be shared anonymously and in real time on your classroom projector or interactive whiteboard. From your device, you can isolate individual answers, toggle responses, and even do cool things like overlay all of the drawings your students have shared. Let's walk through a session to find out how.
Quick, let's go.
It's very intuitive.
So, it goes along with Kahoot and Perusal. I mean, there's just so many tools out there. And to be perfectly honest, I haven't looked at what the cost of this is yet. And I'm not supposed to present technologies until we've actually vetted them and looked through them. But this seems to me like across the system, a group of people who might be interested in looking at something like this, using something like this. And seems like it would work in those video conference courses. It is intended to be synchronous, but you wouldn't all have to be in the same room. And yet providing feedback, engaging in the learning, built right into your PowerPoint presentation. So I just thought it was pretty cool. I thought this was an opportunity to demo it, sort of. Well, for Chris to demo it. Thanks, Chris. So
It seems to solve a number of problems in terms of sharing synchronously from multiple devices. And then as an instructor, that idea that you could pull things out to highlight and emphasize themes, that's really attractive.
and perhaps keeping your students who have their computers in the classroom on task and not Facebooking or whatever it is they do in this instant messaging or snagging it or whatever it is they do. All right, other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much, Brian and
Tom.
Phil and Tom, I know.
Rob, Keegan, and Julie
Have they left? Okay,
went back
all right.
to the lab.
Yeah, thank you all very much. And our last session is 2:30 to 3:30, so everybody gets a little break. And then we'll be talking about different uses of Blackboard, which we've kind of heard about through the day as well. So thank you.
I do believe the clinical experience went up. That's my personal opinion, and also from student evaluations and evaluations from surgeons in later labs. For a variety of reasons, all of them good, we have sort of phased out our live animal teaching laboratories for purely laboratory. We introduced a variety of computer simulations and models, several of them that we developed here at the college. And then eventually in 2010, we eliminated most of our live animal laboratories, again, for some very good reasons. But that kind of left our students with a decline in their clinical experience. And so in an effort to increase their clinical experience without using live animals, we thought about employing some high fidelity simulation into their training together with our lecture. And so that's where the arrow points upward and points to a question mark. It's an interesting question to us to evaluate this and to find out if it's working, how well it's working, and how we might adjust it to kind of help our students in the future. So the simulation that we have developed in our clinical simulation laboratory is a hybrid simulation that's a computer simulation of anesthetic machine and monitor, and that can be seen in the upper right slide in the big computer screen there. That is controlled usually by me in the back room, and I will manipulate varying monitor settings, control patient's blood pressure and EKG and heart rate and all that stuff. The students are on the other side of the room, and they're in a mocked up surgery room with an anesthesia machine and like I said, a task trainer for a patient. And so they will respond to the simulation, they will adjust controls and settings on the anesthesia machine and respond to various events that they would see in an actual live patient. And we do this without any live patients, just with the computers and with the mannequins. So we developed several scenarios that the students would see in typical conduct of anesthesia on a live animal. And we came up with several learner takeaways for each of these scenarios, what we wanted the students to take away or get out of this session, and then ways of performance measures, how we would measure if the students did or got the takeaways appropriately, if they performed adequately. And so those are kind of listed up there. These are very time consuming to create. They take probably 4 to 8 hours to create each one, but the good part is once you've created one, you can reuse it and reuse it for many, many times. The right part of the slide just shows a progression of events in the simulation, a series of states that the simulation goes through and what the students experience through that. And of course, we adjust the simulation on the fly based on the students' responses. So this is a recorded session that is in our simulation lab, and I'm just going to play a short clip of this. And you may or may not be able to hear the student banter that's going.
Keegan to talk about GoPro videos in surgical training.
Okay, great. Thanks, Phil. As Phil mentioned, my name is Rob Keegan. I am an anesthesiologist at the vet school here at WSU. And then you're going to be hearing from Dr. Noyes, who is working with me on this project to assess our students using GoPro videos during their anesthesia and surgery labs. I just kind of wanted to set the stage and talk a little bit about how we got where we are. This is a timeline from the time I've been here. I realized I've been here a really long time now, coming here in 1988. And it's just a timeline of how we have taught our anesthesia course and how we've incorporated clinical skills into anesthesia. And so the timeline is listed there, and then there is a little arrow that shows the amount of clinical experience, relative clinical experience that our students have gotten, the different methods that we've used to teach. So when I first came, the anesthesia course was simply a lecture-only course. We did participate in a live animal laboratory, but it was not part of the course per se. Later on, that was not the best way we thought to teach anesthesia, and we felt that it had to have some type of a clinical laboratory component. So we added a laboratory component to that. And
Good afternoon, branch campuses from around the state. My name is Phil Mixter, coming to you from the Pullman campus, and I'm simply introducing the afternoon session for about the next hour. We're going to focus on technology that engages students in a couple of different contexts. Just really briefly, our first presentation is about GoPro video in the surgical lab session, or setting rather, and we have Dr. Rob Keegan and Dr. Noyes from the clinical training program associated with veterinary clinical sciences at Washington State University. Our second presenter is Brian Collins, an assistant professor in physics and material sciences, and he's going to talk about using Perusal, which is a software program that allows discussion of PDF content asynchronously by your students. You can use that with textbooks that are available online, and Brian will talk more about that. Our last presentation is Dr. Tom Salsbury, who's an associate professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning. He teaches in the elementary and secondary education programs, and he will use AMS in a number of ways in the Masters in Teaching program. And his students are divided between Pullman and Spokane, so he'll solve the distance challenge in a number of creative ways for future K through 12 teachers. So with that, I'll encourage you to settle in, and I'll turn the floor over to Dr.
Going back and forth. But there is the monitor, the simulation, computer simulation we developed. It's got parts of an EKG, parts of an anesthetic machine, and various monitors that display heart rate, temperature, and all various things that you would see when providing anesthesia to a patient. So this goes on, the students will see potentially adverse effects occurring, and then they will go ahead and they will respond to those adverse effects, and then their response is evaluated in the simulation, and conditions change, and they can see what the results of their actions are. So part of what we're interested in doing is not only replacing the live animal laboratories with non-live animal equivalents or potentially things that are better, but we're interested in how well we were doing, so some way of assessing the students. So there's two parts of that. I'm going to talk about the first part, and then Julie is going to go talk about the clinical assessment that occurs in their subsequent junior surgery live animal lab that they do the following semester. But for in terms of assessment for just the simulation course itself, we did a self-efficacy study before and after the course, and we asked them a variety of questions about, can I do this skill or can I not do this skill at this time? And we also gave them a written quiz. So prior to